Greetings everyone, welcome to the 6th episode of Churches of Wales Season 1. In this series, I take a look at buildings part of the Church in Wales and covenanted churches in Wales. In the last episode, I looked at churches that are situated to the north and west of Newtown, where I saw many beautiful buildings in settlements like Carnor, Caersus, Llandinam, and more. In this episode, I will look at churches situated around the towns of Llanidloes and Machynlleth, and this is the final episode in the series where I will be looking at churches in the historic county of Montgomeryshire. I am Fabian Musto, and I present you the first season of Churches of Wales. In order to find these churches, I will use the Ordnance Survey map on Geograph as my reference for spotting church symbols, from maps of the 1920s, to maps of the 2010s and 20s. I apologize if some of my pronunciations of these place names are incorrect, since I am not a Welsh speaker. The first place I am at is a rural hamlet, and this chapel is 10 yards north of the boundary with the historic county of Radnorshire. This is the old Calvinistic Methodist chapel of 1884, built on the site of an earlier chapel in 1826. Built in the simple Gothic style, this was converted into a house by 2002. That hamlet is in the community of Llangurig, which has a parish church dedicated to a saint that gave the settlement its name, because he reputedly founded the church here during the 6th century. The church became part of the Abbey lands of Strata, Florida by the turn of the 13th century, and the West Bell Tower was first built at this time. This was rebuilt in the Perpendicular style during the 15th century. The building is the first church by the River Wye, since the source of the Wye is several miles northwest from the village. The nave, chancel and north aisle were built in the 15th century, and the chancel screen was rebuilt in 1878, a reconstruction of the original medieval screen of the 15th century. The barrel-vaulted wood-panelled roof is also in the style of the 15th century. The church was restored from 1877 to 78 by Sir George Gilbert Scott and Arthur Baker, and they retained 3 medieval windows. Most of the stained glass in the windows date from the restoration by Scott and Baker. The tall pointed tower arch is unplastered unlike the walls of the building, and the church was Grade 2 star listed in March 1953. The path leading northeast from the church goes to the Lich Gate, built in 1740 and altered in the 19th century. This was Grade 2 listed in March 2005, along with the memorial to Chevalier Lloyd. He was responsible for the patronage of the church restoration in 1877, and he provided a sum of £11,000. Placed on high ground is the Ebenezer Methodist Chapel, which is north of the parish church. This was built in 1828 of the vernacular style, built on the site of an earlier chapel in 1814. Extended in 1865, this is still in use as a place of worship. Situated east of the parish church is the former Calvinistic Methodist Chapel, built in the simple Gothic and arts and crafts style in 1904. This replaced earlier chapel buildings from 1832 and 1867. Several miles northwest from Llangurig is an isolated Calvinistic Methodist chapel, despite it is situated by the thunderous A44 road. First built in 1810 and altered in 1817, the chapel was rebuilt in the sub-classical style in 1874. The chapel was still a place of worship in 1981, but by 2002 it was disused. It was converted to a private house after 2017. Situated between Llangurig and Llanidloes is the hamlet of Cumbellan, which has 2 chapel buildings adjacent to each other. I am standing by the former English Wesleyan Methodist Church, which was first built in 1835 and enlarged between 1855 and 1858. Renovated in 1910, the chapel was in use as a place of worship until the 2000s, when it was converted to a private house in 2010. Situated tens of yards east from that chapel is the Sion English Baptist Church, first built in 1828, and rebuilt in 1857. Built in the simple round-headed style, This was enlarged in 1860, and still houses a place of worship as of September 2022. The chapel and adjoining minister's house were Grade II listed in July 2000. I am in the market town of Llanidloes, noted for its old timber-framed market hall from 1600, the only surviving building of this type in Wales. The town takes its name from this Celtic saint from the early 7th century, whom is the patron saint of this church. The West Bell Tower dates from the 14th century, and northwest of it is the church hall of 1982, built by Philip G. Harrison. The nave of the church was rebuilt in 1542, when this intriguing hammer beam roof of 19 bays was installed. The roof is in its full length here, and was borrowed from the closed Cistercian monastery at Abbey Combe here. The 5-bay arcade from around 1210 was also borrowed from the abbey, a fine example of the early English style. The north aisle was added in 1542. The church was restored in the 18th century, with the south wall rebuilt in 1816. The Millennium window of 2000 can be found in this wall. The chancel was enlarged when G.E. Street restored the church from 1880 to 82. The church was Grade II listed in October 1950, and the building is the first church on the River Severn. Llanidloes is also the first town by the River Severn, and there are many chapels to be found here. They all have astonishing appearances, and the Zion Congregational Church behind me is an example. Set back from Shortbridge Street and situated south of the parish church, this was built by John Humphreys in 1878, and this replaced an earlier chapel building from 1824. A brick schoolroom was built to the rear of the chapel in 1932, and the chapel interior was altered slightly in the 1960s. This was Grade II star listed in April 1989. Situated opposite the United Reformed Church is the English Baptist Church, built to a design by Richard Owen of Liverpool from 1876 to 77. The building also replaced a chapel from 1824, and the chapel building was Grade II listed in April 1989. The rear of the building is on Chapel Street, and to the southeast is the Calvinistic Methodist Chapel on China Street, built by the Reverend William Jones in 1874. This chapel was built in the same style as the Zion Congregational Church, and the building was Grade II listed in April 1989. The 3 chapels I looked at are still in use as a place of worship, but the next 3 closed for worship some time ago. The chapel behind me is the former Calvinistic Methodist Church on Bethel Street, built to an Italianate style design by Richard Owen of Liverpool in 1872. The chapel has an adjoining hall to the north, built in the classical style in 1821 to a design by Thomas Hughes of Liverpool. This was first built in 1770, and enlarged in 1804. This was used as an ironmonger's shop in the 20th century. The chapel housed an English Presbyterian church before it closed in 2004. And is being converted to a community hall and garden as of 2022. Situated east of Church Street is the former Methodist Church, built in the Italianate Gothic style in 1874. Situated in Longbridge Street, the building replaced an earlier chapel building from 1802, which was enlarged in 1822. The chapel closed as a place of worship in 2018, and was converted to a private house from 2020 to 2022. Here is the former Wesleyan English Methodist Chapel in Llanidloes, built in 1862 of the classical style. This chapel closed in 1922, and subsequently housed a county intermediate school. This Grade II listed building is north of Longbridge. Here is the Catholic Church of Our Lady and St. Richard Gwyn, situated on the outskirts of the town to the southwest. This looks like a building from the 1970s, and the chapel is still in use as a place of worship. Situated a mile northwest from that church is a disused Calvinistic Methodist chapel, built in 1863 of the simple Gothic style. The chapel closed as a place of worship by 2002, and the lofty trees surrounding the site were cleared in 2021. A few miles southwest from that chapel is a former Wesleyan Methodist chapel, and the building has been remodeled since its conversion to a private house in 2000. The building was built in a mixed style with round-headed windows in 1855. Here is a rural Calvinistic Methodist chapel northwest of the previous chapel, built in 1901 to a design by William Jones in the subclassical style. This building is north of the Infant River Severn, and closed as a place of worship in 2001. This is now a private house. Situated 100 yards southeast from that chapel is an independent chapel, situated on the south side of the River Severn. First built in 1828, this was rebuilt in the simple round-headed style in 1877, and was converted to a private house during the 20th century. Situated in the Hafren Forest is one of the most remote chapels in Powys, and this is the first chapel by the River Severn. This Calvinistic Methodist chapel, now a private house, was built in the vernacular style in 1891. It is tens of yards southeast from the entrance to the Hafren Forest. Situated several miles north of Llanidloes is the Calvinist Methodist chapel in Wyvan, built in the subclassical style in 1907. The adjoining Sunday school was also built that year, and the chapel building was altered in the 2010s. Situated tens of yards northwest is the English Methodist Church, first built in 1850 and rebuilt in 1872. Built in the Lombardic style, the chapel was designed by George B. Ford of Burslem. Several miles northwest from that chapel is a rural Calvinistic Methodist chapel, built in the simple Gothic style in 1881. This also housed a Sunday school, and the building was converted to a private house in the late 20th century. Situated by the B4569 road is a former Calvinist Methodist chapel, which has been remodeled to a private house, since the chapel closed in 1959. This was built in the simple round-headed style in 1860. Here is the parish church of St. Michael in this village and community, founded by this person during the mid-12th century. The church was rebuilt from 1864 to 65 by Poundley and Walker, using the foundations of the medieval church. The church was Grade II listed in February 2005. Situated north of the parish church is the English Methodist Church, built in 1872 on the site of two earlier chapels. Those buildings were built in 1809 and 1852, and this chapel is by the B4569 road. Also situated by that road is the former Welsh Calvinist Methodist Chapel, which was converted to a private house during the 2000s. The chapel building was built in 1870, and it adjoins a former British school of 1860 to its left. Situated a few miles northwest from that settlement is another former Calvinistic Methodist chapel, first built in 1844 and rebuilt in 1862. The second chapel here was built in the simple round-headed style, and was converted to a house by 2000. The two domestic dwellings behind me were developed on the site of an old church, which was dedicated to the Holy Trinity. Also known as Christ Church, this was built during the 19th century as a Catholic church. The congregation declined shortly after the building was completed, and it fell into a dilapidated state as seen in this photograph. Nothing much survives of the exterior, with the exception of the footbridge leading to the grounds. The dwellings were up for sale in recent times, and photographs showed the ceiling, tower arch, and west end window intact. Situated north of that church is the former English Wesleyan Methodist Chapel, first built in 1844 and rebuilt in 1872. The first chapel survives as a private house, and the second chapel was converted to a private house in 2021. There is one chapel in the hamlet that is still a place of worship, and this is the Calvinistic Methodist Chapel of 1871. First built in 1810, the second building on the site was built of stone in the simple Gothic style. Some 2 miles southwest from that hamlet is a former Baptist chapel, built from 1835 to 37 in the vernacular style. This replaced an earlier chapel from 1824, and the second chapel was restored in 1893. I am in the small village of Staylittle, which has 3 chapel buildings. One of them is the Baptist Chapel of 1874, built in the simple round-headed style. This replaced an earlier chapel from 1805, built by N. Jones of Staylittle and enlarged in 1859 by D. Vaughan. The other chapel in Staylittle is a Welsh Calvinist Methodist chapel, built in the simple Gothic style in 1875. Designed by D. Williams of Chemise, this replaced an earlier chapel of 1806 across the B4518 road. The second chapel is set back from the B4518 road. Here is the Church of St. David in Deliver, built from 1852 to 56 to a design by David Brandon. This was built in order to service the needs of a growing population of lead miners and their families, but the population of the hamlet declined in the early 20th century. The church was demolished in 1962, and the foundations are the only remnants of the building. The churchyard is still in use as of 2022, and the last christening in the church happened in 1926. Deliver had 2 chapels that are situated northeast from St. David Church. The Sion Baptist Church, built in 1857, is now a private house. The former Calvinistic Methodist Chapel of 1840, built in the vernacular style, is situated west of the Baptist Chapel. Situated many miles north from Staylittle is this hamlet, which used to have 2 Methodist chapels. The building closest to the camera is the site of the Calvinist Methodist Chapel, first built in 1823 and rebuilt in 1879. The other chapel, a Wesleyan Methodist chapel, was built in 1872 by an old school. This chapel closed in 1971. Some 3 miles north from that hamlet, is a rural Calvinistic Methodist chapel, which also housed a Sunday school. This building, from the 19th century, was converted to a private house during the 20th century. Situated by the village of Lann is a small village with 2 chapels. The chapel behind me is the Bethel Calvinistic Methodist Chapel, first built in 1767 and rebuilt in 1820. This was modified in 1861 and altered in 1895, and the chapel was Grade II listed in January 1997. Placed tens of miles northeast from there is the Independent Chapel, built in 1843 of stone. This building is now a private house, and was also Grade II listed in January 1997. There is a church in Lann that is dedicated to St. Mary, situated a mile north from the chapels I looked at previously. This building is on a knoll that was allegedly founded by this saint around 560 AD, and the building mainly dates from the 14th and 15th centuries. The church was extended in the 17th century, when the west bell tower and north transept were added. The pulpit was also built during this century, and the church was first restored from 1748 to 49, then from 1854 to 60. The church was Grade II star listed in July 1962. Situated a mile west from Llanbrynmawr is an independent chapel in this hamlet, built in 1810 of stone in the vernacular style. This chapel is situated by this river, and despite this chapel is over 2 centuries old, it does not have listed status as of 2022. There used to be a church in Llanbrynmawr back then, and this was dedicated to St. John. Presumably built around the 19th century, there are no photographs of the church building, but the rectangular churchyard remains intact. Situated east of the former railway station is the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel, built in 1872. This closed in 1971 and was disused until the 2000s, when it was converted to a private house. Situated a mile southeast from Llanbrynmawr is an independent chapel, which was founded in 1669. This congregation first met in a timber-framed lean-to outbuilding at a farm, situated south of the present site of the chapel. This chapel building was first built in 1739 and enlarged in 1778, then rebuilt in 1821 and renovated from 1874 to 78. This was remodeled in the vernacular and sub-classical style in 1881, as seen in this photograph from the 1880s. This was altered in 1904, and the building has remained the same since then. This was Grade 2 listed in January 1997. Here is a rural independent chapel in the hamlet of Pandy, situated a mile north from the village of Llanbrynmawr. This was built in 1808, and the chapel closed as a place of worship in the 20th century. The building was extended in the 2010s. Situated a mile northeast from that hamlet is a rural independent chapel, which is in a forest. This was built in 1818 of the vernacular style, and is now a private house. Here is an independent chapel north of Chemise, built in 1861 of the vernacular and sub-classical style. This replaced an earlier chapel of 1819, and the vestry building is situated west of the chapel. Situated some 10 yards northeast is the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel of 1870, built in the simple round-headed style. This replaced an earlier chapel from 1836, and the chapel closed as a place of worship in 2009. The Calvinist Methodist Chapel in Chemise was first built in 1780, then rebuilt in 1810. It was rebuilt in the classical style in 1875, to a design by Richard Owen of Liverpool. Situated tens of yards north of that chapel is the church, dedicated to this Welsh saint from the 6th century. Built in the medieval times, this was mainly rebuilt in the 19th century with the interior improved in 1902. Here is a disused independent chapel in Chemise Road, first built in 1816 and rebuilt in 1870. This was replaced by a new building 10 yards east, built in 1912 of the vernacular style. Both of the chapel buildings are now private residences. Situated a mile northwest from Chemise Road is a Calvinist Methodist chapel, built in 1821 of the vernacular style. There is a manse adjoining the building, and the chapel is now a private house. Situated 3 miles northeast from Machynlleth is the village of Llanryn, and they have a parish church dedicated to these two saints. The church building mainly dates from the late 15th century, and the 8-bay nave roof and stained glass in the east end window dates from this century. The church was restored in 1864 by Benjamin Ferry, and was Grade 2 star listed in August 2004. Situated east of the church is a Calvinist Methodist chapel, built in 1825 of the Gothic style. The chapel was converted to a private house after it closed for worship in the mid-20th century. Situated on the outskirts of the village to the west is the independent chapel, which is in a dilapidated state as of 2022. This was built of the simple Gothic style in 1825, and is by the B4404 road. This independent chapel is east of the county boundary with Gwynedd, and this building dates from 1895. This closed as a place of worship in the 1980s. There is an Ebenezer Methodist chapel 10 yards east from the previous chapel, but this is in another settlement. This is because the chapel is east of this river, near its confluence with the River Dwlas. This chapel was first built in 1841, then rebuilt in 1875 in the simple Gothic style. The building closed for worship in the 20th century. Here is the parish church of St. Peter in the market town of Machynlleth, the town that was the seat of Owain Glyndwr's Welsh Parliament in 1404. The church was founded in the 6th century by this Cornish saint, and the dedication to St. Peter dates from the 13th century. The church building from this century was demolished in the 1820s, and this drawing from the early 19th century presumably depicts the old building. The church was rebuilt in 1827 by Edward Haycock of Shrewsbury, with the exception of the west bell tower of the 15th century, and was altered from 1864 to 66 by Poundley and Walker. They added the chancel arch and east end window, and the interior was further modified for the last time in 1894. The organ in the chancel was installed by William Hill and Son in 1874, and the church was Grade II listed in January 1952. Situated north of the parish church is the Baptist Church on Doll Street, originally built in 1838. This was rebuilt in 1896 in the Gothic style by Thomas E. Morgan of Aberystwyth. This Wesleyan Methodist chapel was built in 1880 of the classical style, and this replaced an earlier chapel of 1806 that was extended in 1843. The chapel closed in the 1980s, and it was converted into an arts center and gallery in 1986, when it became one of 6 exhibition spaces of the Museum of Modern Art. The independent chapel of 1824 is situated east of the previous chapel, and this was Grade II listed in November 1990. The first building on the site was built in 1789, which was replaced by the present building of 1824. This was restored in 1875, and a Sunday school was built to the rear in 1892. The organ was installed by Wadsworth from 1913 to 16. The community church in Machynlleth is southeast from St. Peter Parish Church, and this was built in 1876 to a design by local architect David Owen. The bell tower presumably had a spire back then. Placed south of the A489 road is the Calvinistic Methodist Chapel, built in 1867 to a design by William Henry Spall of Oswestry. This was first built in 1784 and rebuilt in 1822. And the present building was built in the Gothic style. This was Grade II listed in November 1990. Situated tens of yards west from that chapel is a long-gone independent chapel, built in 1840 and closed in 1875 when another independent chapel in the town was restored. The building was used as a meeting room by that chapel in the 1930s. There was a Calvinistic Methodist chapel on Poplar Road in the 19th century, but the building was demolished during the 20th century. No buildings have been built on the site since, but there was a church in Machynlleth that was demolished in the 20th century. The town library is on the site of the Christ Church building, built in 1881 by the A489 road. The church was a place of worship for 8 decades, and the church closed on 3rd of October 1965. It was demolished in August 1967 to make way for the town library. There was another Calvinistic Methodist chapel in the town that was demolished in the 20th century, and this was Chapel Norton, first built in 1784 and rebuilt in 1823. There was also a Wesleyan Methodist chapel in the town, built in the mid-19th century, but this closed by 1900. The building behind me is opposite the site of that chapel, and this is the Roman Catholic Church of St. Maya and Our Lady Help of Christians. Situated north of the A489 road, this was built in 1965 to a design by Sir Percy Thomas and Son. Between Machynlleth and Dovey Junction railway station is this hamlet, which had 4 chapels by 1900. The chapel behind me is an independent chapel, built in the vernacular style in 1848. This was converted to a private house by 2002, and there used to be another chapel west from here, but this was demolished during the 20th century. Situated west from those chapels is a Calvinist Methodist chapel, first built in 1823 and rebuilt in 1875, designed by architect J. H. Jones of Birmingham. The simple Gothic-style building closed for worship in the 20th century. The Wesleyan Methodist Chapel was built by the A487 road in 1858, replacing an earlier chapel from 1843. Built in the vernacular style, the chapel appearance was modified into a house after its closure in the 20th century. Situated southeast from that settlement is a hamlet by the county boundary with Ceredigion. There is a miniature independent chapel that was built 2 centuries ago in 1822, and was refitted around 1870. This was Grade II listed in November 1997. There is a Wesleyan Methodist chapel north from the previous chapel, and this was built in 1821 and rebuilt in 1849. The chapel closed for worship in the 20th century, and has remained derelict since then. Here is a village church set back from the A489 road, presumably founded in the medieval times, since it is situated in an oval churchyard. The patron saint is a Welsh saint from the 6th century, and the church was built in 1884 by John Pritchard in the simple decorated Gothic style. The church had a bell tower over the chancel that was demolished in 1939, and the church was Grade II listed in May 2005. Situated east of the church are 3 chapels in the village, and the chapel to my left is a Calvinist Methodist chapel, built in the simple round-headed style in 1840. The chapel closed for worship in the 20th century. There is an independent chapel that is also by the A489 road, and this was built in the simple Gothic style in 1823. This is adjacent to the Wesleyan Methodist chapel, which was rebuilt 3 times. This was first built in 1823 and rebuilt in 1848, 1872 and 1906. The chapel closed in 1972, and was subsequently modified to a house. Situated southwest from that village is the hamlet of Forge, which has a former Calvinist Methodist chapel from 1825, but was rebuilt in the simple Gothic style in 1872. This is now a private residence. Situated southeast from that chapel is a rural Wesleyan Methodist chapel, built in 1841. This chapel closed in 1913, and was converted to a private house afterwards. The building was renovated in 2021. Situated a few miles southwest from there is one of the most rural chapels in Powys, since it is north of several mountains with an average summit from 500 meters high. This is the Saw Independent Chapel, built in 1819 and rebuilt in 1882 of the vernacular style. The chapel is now a private house. Here is the Bethlehem Independent Chapel in this village, built in 1860 in the style of the Reverend Thomas Thomas. The building was Grade II listed in July 2000. There is a former Calvinistic Methodist chapel north of that village, and this was first built in 1812, then rebuilt in 1856. It was rebuilt for the last time in 1888, and the building is in the vernacular and simple Gothic style. Situated on high ground above this hamlet is a Sion Baptist chapel, first built in 1819, rebuilt in 1858 and rebuilt again in 1906. Designed by J. Lewis Evans of Aberystwyth in the subclassical style, the building closed for worship in the 2000s. Situated some 2 miles northwest from that chapel is this Wesleyan Methodist chapel, which was built in the simple Gothic style in 1865. This replaced earlier chapel buildings from 1816 and 1825, and is now a private house. Situated 5 miles east of Machynlleth is this hamlet, which has a church dedicated to St. Tudor. Built from 1862 to 64 on the site of a medieval church, this building is in an oval churchyard, and the church does not have listed status as of 2022. There is a Wesleyan chapel southwest from the church, and this was built in 1823 and rebuilt in the vernacular and simple Gothic style in 1883. This was converted to a private house in the 20th century. Placed 1.5 miles northeast from that hamlet is another hamlet, situated by the A470 road. They have a former Wesleyan chapel from 1868, built in the simple round-headed style, and this replaced an earlier chapel from 1807. The last chapel I will look at in this episode is situated 1 mile northeast from the hamlet, and this is the former Calvinistic Methodist chapel. Built in the 19th century, this building also closed for worship in the 20th century, and is now a private house. I am in the Severn Park in Llanidloes to end this episode, the last episode in the series where I will look at churches in the historic county of Montgomeryshire. I enjoyed looking at religious buildings in this historic county, as well as the religious buildings I looked at in this episode. I will begin looking at the historic county of Radnorshire in the next episode, where I will look at religious buildings to the northwest of Knighton.